Dr. Fleming has a Bachelor's of Landscape Architecture degree from the University of Arkansas. He worked professionally and then went back to the University of Texas to receive a master's in planning. While at the University of Texas, he had a wonderful opportunity to work on policy as part of the Obama administration. So he moved to Washington, D.C., and founded a nonprofit that was looking at the relationship between policy and the built environment. After, I guess, 80-hour work weeks in Washington, D.C., he decided to go back to the University of Pennsylvania to get a PhD, so he's now Dr. Fleming, and he is the founding director of the McHarg Center, the newly found McHarg Center. For those of you that aren't familiar with Ian McHarg, you should do a little bit of research on him. His landslide book, Design with Nature. For the anniversary, the McHarg Center has published a really excellent book that I'll give a plug for. I recommend everyone purchase, which is Design with Nature Now. We are very happy to have Billy here, and I will say he's one of the most inspiring speakers I've seen and has very excellent work, and he's very unapologetic about linking the relationship between policy and the built environment. So with that, I'll turn the stage over to Dr. Fleming, and we look forward to your lecture. So welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Is this thing on? Can you all hear me? Okay. Just want to thank you so much for inviting me here, Sarah, and everyone else on the faculty. Sarah mentioned I grew up in public housing in rural Arkansas, first-gen college grad, and so Penn feels like a very disorienting place most of the time. This feels much more like home, so thank you for making me feel like I'm at home while I've been here the last couple of days, or day and a half. So I wanted to start with the least controversial image I could possible, so everyone feels great about the Green New Deal after this. I want to talk, we'll talk a little bit about sort of what the G&D is. We'll spend more time talking about kind of why it is the way it is and why I and some colleagues in the McHarg Center at Penn have been asked to help shape it now and kind of what we're doing. But we'll also talk about sort of its central reference, which is the New Deal. But first, I think any talk like this has to begin by talking about what the sort of global forces are that are sort of putting climate change at the center of so many of these conversations. If you haven't seen this interview or seen the weird TED Talk Bjarke gave before he decided to go work for an eco-fascist in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, he had this idea called hedonistic sustainability, in which his idea for dealing with climate change was that the optimal way to do it is to make sure that like nothing in anyone's life ever changes. We just kind of do a lot of stuff behind the scenes and you don't really notice that anything has really changed. And so he's at the beginning of this talk, he's giving this quote here, where he's sort of imagining that climate change has been changed completely by accident, and nobody knew it was happening. Whoops, like we're going to try and fix it without noticing the same way we sort of created it without noticing. And for anyone who's actually spent time with the science, spent time with the literature on climate change, you know, right, that actually over half of all the emissions ever created in the history of the world come from about 100 companies. Almost all of those are located in either the global north or the west. Most are privately owned, a few are state-owned in Latin America and a few other places. And while it would be nice, I think, to imagine that we can sort of tweak ourselves behaviorally to get ourselves out of this sort of situation by doing away with plastic straws, by driving less, by eating less meat, the reality is that the ability to do anything about planetary climate change through those kinds of interventions alone is never going to get us anywhere. And so the Green New Deal is sort of coming together out of a recognition that, in fact, like these are global systems. We're looking here at carbon emissions. Not a huge surprise, right, to see them just literally sort of on fire in the northern hemisphere and very sort of scant throughout the southern hemisphere. And this is, I say this in part because I don't mean to disparage those other kind of behavioral changes or say that we shouldn't all be trying to do some little piece of this, but that the Green New Deal is emerging as a sort of set of structural reforms to the economy, to our lives, in part because it's the only way we're actually going to be able to take on the challenges that climate change presents in any way that's going to matter. And we were talking about this a little bit at lunch today, that, you know, for designers, for landscape architects, city planners, who have spent the last half century or more designing beautiful projects and doing lots of things at a site scale that are quite interesting, while also talking about the desire to take on the various things they care about at a real scale, at a scale that can have real impact. The Green New Deal is actually the only policy vehicle put on the table in our lifetimes that gives us an opportunity to think seriously about that. I'm not going to play this whole video because it's super weird and kind of creepy. I don't know, has anyone seen this before? Nobody? I'll play a little bit of it then. This is a bit of like propaganda put forward by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Naomi Klein, and a few others, trying to do what designers I think should be thinking a little bit more about, which is trying to imagine a world rebuilt by the Green New Deal. This is happening in part because so much of the narrative around the GND has been driven by folks who actually have no interest in it, who are I think, materially hurt by the prospect of a GND, and who framed it as like a plan to do away with air travel and hamburgers, which is not. It's just not. I can't find a single piece of documentation that would ever sort of make such a claim. So what they're trying to do in this video is show you what a world redesigned by the sort of promise of a GND would actually mean. So if we think about if we think about the sort of three planks of the GND as being jobs, justice, and decarbonization, what would that mean if realized through transformations in the built environment? We won't watch this whole thing because it's like a little long, but it's there if you want it. Get this to go. So I said, one thing we should do, I think, before we get into the sort of weeds of what the Green New Deal is and why it's emerging now at this particular moment, is just to take the New Deal seriously. So I say seriously as I put this weird poster of a dinosaur with syphilis on the screen. I have this weird book called Posters for the People that has like 20 other posters like that in it. I do not understand how that was ever approved by anyone, but here we are. We should take the New Deal seriously for lots of reasons. One is that it built around 60,000 or so projects all around the country. I think we imagined the New Deal as this thing that created Social Security, expanded health coverage for certain people, these universal programs, sort of the only ones we have in this country that tend to exist in other parts of the world. But it actually also transformed the built and natural environment of this country. And Sarah and her partner David have put out a really incredible book I'll talk about in just a second, looking at the ways it sort of transformed the shelter belts of the Midwest, but it actually did many, many other things too. And one of the things that made the New Deal possible was this confluence of three crises. So one being an ecological crisis that Sarah's book is dealing with, which is the Dust Bowl and the forced migration of about 3 million people from the Midwest, mostly to the Central Valley of California. The sort of economic crisis of the 20s and 30s, or the 30s and 40s, which is the global depression, and 20% unemployment. And the third being the sort of rise of global fascism or a political crisis. All of those things sort of coalescing to give FDR and his advisors the sort of political space they need to think about a huge national program like the New Deal. And this is just as a quick point of reference to give you a sense of like how many things it built in the US. This is showing you about a quarter of all the projects ever built by the New Deal. This is the Living New Deal. It's a really incredible resource for anybody who wants to play around with it. This is kind of an old screenshot. It's been updated since then. I'll show you some of those in just a second. But it would be impossible for you to find a public university, a city of any size over about 5,000 people, and even some below that, without some facility, building, park, or other piece of infrastructure built by the New Deal. And there's an excellent book that talks about design's sort of place within that transformation of the built and natural environment from Phoebe Cutler, looking at an org chart of all the places that landscape architects went to work in the alphabet agencies of the New Deal from FDR. This puts, one of the things the New Deal did was put all of the out-of-work white-collar workers from the design professions and engineering to work within the federal government, creating a sort of design bureaucracy. Some of these vestiges still live on in the Army Corps and HUD and DOT and a few other places. But if you were to look at this org chart today, it would be much, much smaller. And to just take for a second to look at Sarah's book here, which I've very hastily scanned in, you're getting a sense of the sort of scale of ambition that was part of what the New Deal tried to do, at least in the Midwest, to take these failing sort of agricultural and ecosystem landscapes and to very quickly put a lot of people to work planting a lot of trees to keep as much soil in place as possible, to perform all these other ecological functions, and to do it with sometimes well-paid, sometimes not, forms of labor. And I think this book has become interesting. It took me a while to track it down because everyone bought it, I guess, a couple years ago when it came out, and it was like a 6-month long process for me to find a copy of it. But it's been interesting to me in part because The idea of trees as a part of a national or international climate program has kind of surged back into public conversation. For folks who, for whatever reason, want to torture themselves and watch like things from the World Economic Forum in Davos, you know that like there's been this crazy commitment from the sort of global network of billionaires to plant 1 trillion trees and call that like a day. That's the whole climate plan. And our president, just in his State of the Union the other night, he was at Davos to sort of endorse this plan, sort of made this announcement that that's going to be the extent of the U.S. commitment to climate change a couple days ago. And trees are great, love trees, they do all kinds of things. One thing they're really, really bad at is sequestering carbon. So for a very long time, we've been told that trees are a great instrument for taking carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it back into the soil. Turns out at like any sort of real time scale that matters, so more than the life of the tree as it's being harvested, anywhere from 30 to 50 years depending on the tree, but actually all that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere with very few exceptions. And it also, if I can pull up this next little piece here from MIT Tech Review, I'm going to read a couple notes really quickly. So this is coming from an article that James Temple wrote, interviewed a friend of mine, Jane Flagle, about the limits of this trillion tree idea for climate change. Is that it invites people to view tree planting as a substitute for real action. Not only that, and this is taken from an atlas that we've released I'll talk a little bit more about later on today. This is looking at the potential for tree carbon sequestration projects in the US from a team of scientists who did this for the whole globe. That the best climate change solution available today is not actually trees, and that every single audit we've done now, so we've had these carbon sequestration sort of credit trading systems in operation for 20, 30 years. They're very loosely, if regulated at all. We've been promised certain amounts of sequestration from them, and in every audit, which are now beginning to come online that we've done of them, we're finding out that they're actually only sequestering about 40% of the carbon we were promised. So not only do they not keep carbon in the soil over geologic time periods, which is what matters if we're talking about reversing planetary climate change, but they don't even sequester that much carbon in real time before they're harvested for wood material in ways that we've been told that they would. And in addition to that, they take up huge amounts of land. So if we were to think about just the amount of forest needed, if we set aside that 40% number and assume that they'll get to the number the models have told us for the last 20 or 30 years, so this would actually be about twice the size if we took the actual numbers. This is the amount of land we would need to take carbon out of the atmosphere for the next 100 million or so people in green there that are projected to move to the US by the middle of the century. And for them and everyone else who's here now, that larger gray box is the amount of land we would need. And as you can imagine, like we need that land for other things like growing food, raising like livestock, living, driving, all kinds of other things that can't just be forest for sequestration. And the other thing, which I won't talk too much about, is that these kinds of forest management for carbon sequestration projects have created all kinds of other problems that weren't anticipated in countries like Australia and states like California that have been on fire for most of the last few years because they have huge amounts of fuel in their forest systems that we have not figured out a way to like manage very well. That's mostly a resource problem. We haven't figured out how to pay for people to manage these forests, or we've decided not to figure out how to pay for people to manage them. And so what you wind up with is a bunch of underperforming forests that don't sequester all that much carbon, don't produce a lot of biological diversity, and so they don't help with any of the sort of extinction problems that are going on as a part of the sixth extinction. And they also create huge fire risks for people. And I say that as like a person who loves trees. We need more trees, but this is actually cutting against the argument for building more trees when we dig into the way that they've been instrumentalized in this conversation about climate change. And so I wanted to bring that up in part because I think, while that piece of the history of the New Deal is quite interesting, it's also quite dangerous to lean into. The same is true for the TVA, which for folks in design schools, the extent that you typically get of New Deal history is like the TVA was great. Look how beautiful all the facilities are. Wow, landscape planning at like such a big scale, so cool. This book is great, and I mean that to like disparage this book. It's quite wonderful, very critical, I think, of the TVA in ways that most other design publications are not. There's a great essay from Jane Wolfe in there in particular. But it's called the Tennessee Valley Authority Design and Persuasion. But the TVA itself was a problem for all kinds of reasons. One is that it's completely autocratic, right? So there's no ability to get elected to get a seat on the TVA's board. You're appointed by a statewide elected official for the region that the Tennessee Valley covers, which is Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, a few other places, Georgia, Kentucky. And one of the things that produces is a extremely dirty fuel mix, because those states have a political economy organized almost entirely around coal and fossil fuels. So in order to get elected to a statewide position in one of those states, you typically have to have a strong tie to one of those industries. To get a seat on the TVA's board, you have to be friends with one of those statewide elected officials. And it means that the TVA actually has one of the dirtiest fuel mixes in all of the country. So it's this public utility. Sounds great. Like if we were to just take the Bernie Sanders climate plan and like extrapolate it, it would be in some ways taking the TVA and just like spreading it all over the country. It turns out the TVA is actually quite bad if we're serious about decarbonization. And I bring that up not to like disparage his plan. I worked on his plan. I think it's fine. But because I think we have to puncture some holes in this myth that the TVA is this like idealized form of national-led landscape planning in this country. This is the Norris Dam. It's beautiful. It has all kinds of things going for it. This is, at the time, work was coming off the line. It's putting tens of thousands of people to work throughout the Tennessee Valley. It's creating this network of facilities that have all kinds of interesting design interventions built into them. The facilities themselves are beautiful and sublime. They also have this weird kind of jingoistic like language and lettering up here. You can see built for the people of the United States, kind of plastered on every TVA facility. They have key maps on the floor as you walk in to get a sense of where you are within the network of the TVA. And the whole thing was about reinforcing for people that actually, like, the federal government has invested at the equivalent of trillions of dollars in electrifying the rural South. We should think about like what it can do when it's put to work on certain things. And this is just a really quick key map of the TVA in general. But I bring it up because the TVA, I'll talk about the power challenges around it in just a second, but I want to talk about our friend's work, Brent Siebel, who's written about the TVA and the New Deal more broadly and the various ways in which it reified or reproduced a lot of the worst parts of the Jim Crow South and the other sort of political alliances that were built to make the New Deal possible. So he's writing in here, despite black residents constituting over 7% of the population around Norris, the Norris Dam, which I just showed you a picture of, they made up just 1.9% of the workers who qualified for TVA jobs. Electrification promised significant improvements in standards of living for some rural Americans, but the pernicious inequities of Jim Crow were left largely untouched. And I'll get to sort of why in just a few moments, but I think, again, the TVA is important because there is now, for those of you who follow the Green New Deal conversation, quite a lively movement, an energized movement that's winning a bunch of fights in New York and Michigan and a few other places around public power, around taking private utilities and making them publicly owned and operated. This is coming from a friend of mine, Johanna Bozoa, who's there as a co-author, talking about the need for sort of public control of utilities to decarbonize them. This is my New York Times subscription expired, so this is me trying to get a screenshot before the paywall comes up, sorry. But this is a piece that's really emblematic of like all of the sort of counter arguments that people have made against public power in this country, in which the TVA is very routinely weaponized. It's really easy to point at it as an anti-democratic institution and as a very dirty power institution. It's kind of a disingenuous argument when we think about, again, the political economy that makes it possible. But the TVA is a place we have to stop pointing to as designers as evidence of what is going to be possible with a re-empowered or a reinvigorated state. And just to give you a sense, this is, again, coming from that atlas I'll talk about a little bit later, but this is the extent of the energy infrastructure in the country. The TVA, obviously, clustered right here, but almost all of this is built either from just before the New Deal forward to the 1970s, before there's any regulation of power markets in the country. Outside of the TVA, the entire energy system in the United States is private until about the 1970s. And in lots of ways, I think actually the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, is a much better example for us to think about as we think about a rollout of clean power and cooperative ownership in something like a Green New Deal. And these are just little snippets of propaganda, but the REA itself is dedicated to basically filling in a hole in the energy market that the private sector could not meet. So this is a map of its footprint. These are my students here on the side. I might actually turn these lights off if I can. Well, I'll figure that out later. But anyway, so the REA is established in 1933 as a part of FDR's plan. Thank you for doing that. Well, maybe everyone's. As part of FDR's plan to electrify the rural South and the rural Midwest. And the initial plan was for the REA to act as a broker with private utilities and to say, okay, we're going to help you fund and finance work that you can own and operate in perpetuity after we've sort of done our initial startup phase. And every time they brought a sort of cost estimate back to FDR and the REA, they were 3, 4, or 5 times higher than than the government was willing to pay for them. So a couple years after it was established, FDR decided to just give them the equivalent of $18 billion a year, so $180 billion over the course of the New Deal, to go in and actually build and operate the transmission lines and the generation, and to give all of that power over in cooperative ownership to local farmers and workers and other folks who lived in these places powered by the REA. And over the course of the New Deal, they set up about 800 rural electric co-ops. So any electric co-op in the United States can trace its origin back to the New Deal, either because it was literally created by the REA or because it was inspired by it. It also builds 380,000 miles of transmission line in about 10 years. That's about 40% of all the transmission lines ever built in the history of the United States. And it's doing it in places that the private sector could not serve. As you can imagine, it was clustered in the Northeast, in the West, in places with dense urban footprints. Makes total sense. That's where there are economies of scale for them. But the REA basically powered the rest of the country, the non-urban part of the country, and did it in ways that handed the ownership and the profit and control over to local folks who lived there. Another one we don't talk a lot about, for a good reason, I think, because it has a very high carbon legacy, is the predecessor to the FAA, the CAA, the Civic Aeronautics Authority, which built all kinds of things, including this. This is Midway in Chicago, if you've ever flown through it. But it builds this huge network of municipal airports, some of which have been brought offline in recent years, so Stapleton in Denver, Mueller in Austin, a few others. But it builds out this huge network of airports that we didn't have before. In about 10 years, they're given and spend about $1 trillion doing this. They also build these lines you see kind of connecting all of them, or these weird arrows that you used to have to put on the ground so pilots could look out the window and make sure they were on the right path. This is pre-radar, so they would literally like kind of tilt and make sure and then tilt back. But again, the footprint of what was possible through the CAA in this 10-year period is kind of unfathomable today, where if you go to work on a project with, say, the Army Corps, you're going to spend 10 years trying to get a permit as opposed to like building this amount of work. And this is also true. We're looking at kind of a heat map here, essentially, of the PWA. So you're looking at the density of projects where they built the most things. Obviously, quite a few in Nebraska, as you can see up there. The same is true of the PWA. And again, looking at just the sort of footprint of this, this is the CCC, not the PWA. Just looking at the footprint of them, it's totalizing. It's across the entire United States. It's putting, at its peak, about 600,000 people a year, 3 million total over the course of the New Deal to work building all of these projects. And not doing it, I think people, again, tend to mistake the New Deal as this like very well thought out and super top-down set of ideas and programs. The New Deal itself was, one, totally improvisational. FDR didn't know what the hell he was doing when he started. They had a sort of basic idea to begin with, and it sort of ushered in this period of really, I think, interesting experimentation and innovation in government, in which the ideas that they tried out that worked really well got scaled up really quickly and became things like the WPA, the CCC, and the things that didn't, either because they got struck down by the courts or because they just didn't work very well, got killed pretty quickly. And it began a half-century or so period of sort of government as innovator that has sort of been lost in the last 30 or 40 years. The other is that the New Deal itself wasn't actually that top-down. It handed almost all control over to local governments and institutions, not always to great outcomes. So this is coming from Brent again and one of his partners. The pragmatic political utility of the local administrative autonomy and public-private partnerships that were an essential part of the New Deal, the American federal structure simultaneously presented them with a tool and a barrier. This kind of arrangement, the sort of use of the federal government as a bank, essentially, and a sort of authority-granting machine, made possible the New Deal's most ambitious programs. It also enabled some of the most progressive parts of the New Deal to persist at the state and local levels long after the winds of national politics had changed. But beneath that cheery language of partnership often lay a bitter truth that the prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities. And so I'm not going to talk a ton about this, but the New Deal itself, right, it was a product of a compromise between Northern Republicans and Southern Dixiecrats, essentially. This is at the time of Jim Crow. This is what allows Jim Crow to sort of be extended for another half century or so. And so at the TVA, all the bathrooms are segregated. There's a black and a white bathroom. For the CCC, all the work camps are segregated. There's a camp for white workers, a camp for black workers. And even in the sort of resettlement authority, which builds a bunch of new towns as a part of the sort of Dust Bowl migration and other kinds of migration, often black workers were not paid to work on those projects. They were promised the possibility of home ownership as a part of their payment, only to have it pulled out at the last minute, or pulled out from under them at the last minute, so they'd build a town that they could not live in and not get paid for it. And I say that because we shouldn't romanticize what the New Deal was. It was a pragmatic and in many ways ruthless political strategy that FDR brought forward. And there are lots of things we can learn that we should probably try to reproduce and things that we should not from it. So we're going to look, this is an updated map from the Living New Deal. We're going to look really quickly just in Nebraska, just to give you a sense, because I hadn't thought about the New Deal in Nebraska until Sarah asked me to come do this talk. So I don't know why the cities are not showing up on here, but you can see there's a few in Lincoln, a few in Omaha. Those are like the two Nebraska cities I know, but you can probably like tell if you grew up in a smaller town in central or western or northern Nebraska, like where those dots are relative to where you grew up. Here we are in Lincoln. So that first like dot on the left there, Holmes Elementary School. Does anybody know where this is? Some heads are shaking yes. I don't. Here is Neoaka Public Library. Anybody know this one? A couple heads, yes. The post office in Seward, yeah. And if we, I forget, I think we just went to the northwest here, so Ellsworth, Nebraska, is that right? Northwest? Yeah, I see there's like one head very actively shaking over there. Crescent Lake National Wildlife Refuge, a little further east, Dawes County Courthouse, Valentine National Wildlife Refuge, Ingleside State Hospital, which I think is there's a different name for it. It's been bought out, I think now, but the entire campus itself was built during the New Deal. And I say this just because this is a piece of history that we've actually kind of lost generationally. Sarah and I were talking about this a little bit this morning, that, you know, in fact, like there is a generation, and many of them are now sort of dying, whose lives were transformed by the New Deal, that built the schools, the libraries, the amphitheaters, the campuses, the parks, the airports, the railways, the waterworks and sewers, and everything else that sort of transformed the ability of them to sort of be swept into modernity in their various rural communities. And an important part of the Green New Deal project, I think, is recovering some of these histories, which live in a sense, this is a quarter of them living on the Living New Deal site, but it's very different than like people actually engaging with the material. And so I think thinking through ways to do that is quite important. I'm going to show you an older version of this just because I feel like I'm contractually obligated, having grown up in Arkansas, to just like show you a couple things about Arkansas. So here it is. It's a state, believe it or not, and everyone knows that. This is Fayetteville, where I went to college. This is the campus. I'm not going to do like a million of these like I just did for Nebraska, but I just gave a talk here a few months ago. And my favorite thing about doing it was getting to show them this slide, which is that like the football stadium was built by the PWA. For those of you who like paid attention to college football this year, you know Arkansas was maybe the worst team in the country. Just like when I was a student there, everyone tells me at some point they were good. I've never been alive when that's been true. But even their football stadium, built by the PWA. This is where I went to school. This is Vol Walker Hall. This is the architecture school there. PWA building, built in the 1930s. About half the campus could say the same. And again, so this is coming from Nancy Levinson from Places Journal. I think before the Green New Deal has become a sort of part of the public imagination, expressing some frustration that it seems increasingly clear that the Great Recession, this is almost 10 years ago now, is not sparking a New Deal, and that we confront our crisis in a political climate that is contemptuous to the very idea of the public. And this is happening as I'm working in the Obama administration. I'm at the White House Domestic Policy Council. Those of you who remember the stimulus bill, it passed before I got there, but I was around for its administration. And it was like a point of pride amongst the Council of Economic Advisors and others that no one knew the stimulus happened. They were like, we need to design this thing in a way that no one knows the public has spent any money in their community, which I don't know, like maybe there's some economic literature to back up that idea, but I think anyone who's like ever met a person who didn't get an Ivy League economics degree would know that that's like the worst possible strategy. It makes no sense to think about how you would pour $1 trillion into infrastructure in places where people live and not tell them a little bit about like where that money is coming from. You don't have to do what the TVA did and like hit you over the head with it, but we should probably think about ways to tell stories about what the state is doing in our lives instead of trying to hide all of it. And it's generated all kinds of criticism now in recent years. This is a book from Reed Hunt called A Crisis Wasted. It's incredible. I think it talks about the sort of missed opportunity of that stimulus bill, which spent about $500 billion or so just on infrastructure and public works, and did it with the stipulation that all the projects that it funded had to be shovel-ready. It turned out that most of those shovel-ready projects were terrible projects no one wanted, because they were coming from the earmark era in which like members of Congress would win like a bridge to nowhere, or build a road to nowhere, or build like a facility to nowhere that didn't do anything with federal money to be able to show up and cut a ribbon in their district and then go back to DC. And many of those members had died or been beaten by the time the stimulus came to pass. They'd been sitting on the shelf for like 20 years. And this book is about that and about lots of other ways in which the stimulus failed to actually stimulate much of anything. There's also this incredible book we've been pouring through in a seminar I'm running now with Daniel and Donna Cohen, who's a sociologist at Penn, from Mariana Mazzucato. She's she's an economist and a sort of political historian. She's the dean of the LSE now, London School of Economics. And I'm just going to run you through a couple passages from just the first page of the book, which is one of the most remarkable bits, I think, of thinking about state power and its expression in our lives that I've come across. So, across the globe, countries look to emulate the success of the US economy, and in doing so, they look at the power of market-driven mechanisms versus what might seem like old state-driven mechanisms, typically, it's just cut out here, but typically from Soviet Russia or from Europe. But the US is not what it seems. The preacher of small state, free market doctrine has for decades been directing large public investment programs in technology and innovation that underline its economic success. From the internet to biotechnology to clean energy and even to the shale gas boom, the US state has been the key driver of innovation. And if the rest of the world wants to emulate the US, they should do as it actually did and not as it says it did. And there are chapters in the book dedicated to different pieces of technology that we all sort of take for granted now. My iPhone in my pocket, like every single component of it, built by federal industrial policy. DARPA, which is the sort of military, quiet, stealthy research wing, developed most of it. One of the things Obama did particularly well while he was in office was stand up something called ARPA-E, which is the clean energy equivalent of DARPA. Tesla, which most of you probably know, was going bankrupt in 2009. ARPA-E saved it, along with the rest of the auto industry. So we would have basically no advanced clean energy battery technology without it. All of the profits and all of the patents that are generated from that research go to Elon Musk. They don't go to us. We don't profit from them outside of the tax code. So this book is really about thinking through ways in which we might think about desubmerging or revealing the state and thinking about a different way that the economy gets structured around not only innovation and green innovation, but public ownership of some of those things, since we're all paying for it anyway. So this is happening now also as the IPCC is beginning to release its latest round of reports. It's getting ready to release its new assessment report. It's not quite ready yet, but in the interim, it's put out these. Anybody's seen these before? A couple people. So there's three. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but you have the global warming 1.5 degree report, which is basically saying we're about 50% of the way to 1.5 degrees of warming, which according to like every climate scientist who's involved with the IPCC, which is about 98% of them, that's the absolute maximum that we can warm as a planet without total catastrophe sort of playing out. And they don't think we're actually going to get there. So we're actually probably going to overshoot 1.5 degrees. The next one is about land and all the various sort of demands that climate change as a sort of planetary forcing mechanism and some of the ideas in the Green New Deal about decarbonization are going to be in competition with each other for the same space. It's hugely important as a document for landscape architects in particular. It's basically giving us like our marching orders for the next 50 years. And then a third one about oceans and the various ways in which they're also a part of this sort of land and temperature equation. So those things are coming together while we're also sort of dealing with our own set of overlapping crises, right? We have our own, yeah, there's Stephen Miller, our friend. We have our own ecological crisis, only it's much, much larger than that of the New Deal, right, and planetary climate change. We have our own financial or economic crisis, which, to put it like as generously as possible, we could just call the hangover from the Great Recession of 2009 to 11, which if you were actually hurt by, you've never really recovered from. We could have a longer conversation about a decades-long sort of economic crisis in this country. And then we have the third crisis, our political crisis, which is, again, the resurgence globally of fascism, not only abroad, but also this time at home. And so all of these things are kind of, now we're finally getting to the Green New Deal. New Deal, toss it away. So we're going to talk about the Green New Deal. So we'll talk about the sort of why and the what. So Plan A, for how this thing might actually come together. I mean, the real Plan A was to just do this like 30 years ago when I was a little kid, but nobody did that. So Plan A now, if I can get this to play, was to put together a select committee in the House with subpoena power. So we have this for all kinds of other issues. We have it for national security. We have it for a few other things. And what it would have allowed members to do would be to subpoena experts, activists, industry folks, whoever they really wanted, to give expert testimony in public and for them to be able to then write the package of legislation that could amount to the Green New Deal in public view for all of us to weigh in on in real time all the time. This is part of the beginning of that ask coming from AOC and the Sunrise Movement before she's sworn in as a member of Congress in soon-to-be Speaker Pelosi's office, asking for this select committee. Oh, that's a crazy question on here. Yikes. And as you probably know, if you followed it, we didn't get it. What was offered instead was a select committee without subpoena power, which was turned down by members of Congress. This is the folks being arrested after that protest. And one of the big reasons for that is that there's a committee in the House called the Energy and Commerce Committee. In order to get a seat on it, you have to raise about $500,000 a year from the fossil fuel industry. And so obviously they had very strong feelings about whether or not we should have a select committee in the House on climate change that they didn't control. Frank Pallone, just up the road from me in New Jersey, is the chairman of the ENC, a longtime Democrat from Jersey who is terrible on energy but chairs the Energy and Commerce Committee. And this is, again, just one more headline of them thinking through it. So we had to think kind of differently about what Plan B would be for doing this. And just by way of context, the GND as an idea sort of begins to take shape in 2016. That's when the Sunrise Movement is really beginning to be founded. This is before the election. This is in the middle of the election, really, and sort of gets turbocharged in 2018 or so when AOC decides to run for Congress around the Green New Deal and then wins. And we begin to see a real opportunity to do something with it as it offers us the first real vehicle for fusing the labor movement and the environmental movement and frankly, like the building and trades and unions who we need to bring along with us on all of this and who are actually quite conservative into one movement around decarbonization, jobs, and justice. And Plan B then became sort of manifest through this thing called HR 109, House Resolution 109. It's a non-binding resolution. It's 14 pages. It's a statement of purpose saying, like, here are the general goals we want to reach. Here are the timelines we think are important. And here are some ideas about how to get there. And at this press conference where you see AOC doing this, she's actually very, very clear that they're treating this HR 109 document as a call for proposals. This is like the framework. Now tell us like all the holes in this that we need to fill as soon as you can. Which I've written about in other places, in Places Journal, as like a call for designers to actually engage with this. Because there have been people in the field who've looked at it and said, well, like HR 109 is missing the like 3 or 4 things that my sub field of planning and design care a lot about, so it's like canceled, don't care about it, which is fine, they don't have to care about it, but I think we looked at it in the center as an opportunity to go in and fill in a lot of the missing detail and say, actually, like, you need to think about the way that the buildings and landscape and public work and infrastructure that a Green New Deal would demand have to be figured out on the front end and not after you've won money for this kind of thing. And to their credit, they recognize the need for that right away. So to go into HR 109, these are the things that it sort of calls out for us that are of sort of obvious import to the design professions. One is to build resiliency against climate disasters. 2 is to repair and upgrade all U.S. infrastructure. 3 is to achieve a zero emission energy standard in all buildings and facilities. 4, build an energy efficient and distributed smart grid. To retrofit every existing building in the country for maximum water and energy efficiency, to realign all federal industrial policy around clean manufacturing, to lower all agriculture-driven GHG emissions, and that could happen in many ways. I think David Wallace Wells thinks we just feed cows seaweed and we're done. Probably a couple other things we would do. Another one to overhaul all U.S. transportation systems via inter- and intra-city transit. invest in public lands and other low-tech forms of carbon sequestration, and remediate every hazmat and brownfield site in the US. So like, totally easy, figure this out in 10 years, we'll be done. Not really, these are generational projects, right? The New Deal itself, we think of as a 10-year-long sort of push from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. Actually, the New Deal coalition lasts until the late 60s. It is a multi-generational project, just like responding to climate change will be for us. And this is the first real sort of explicit attempt to stake out the terrain at which those various fights will be waged. And this is HR 109. If you haven't seen it, you should. These are all the various co-sponsors of it. So we were talking about this at lunch too, that in like a normal country where you have a parliament, what we'd be doing right now is just passing a bunch of bills before the next election because we were like interested in getting a lot of things done before we have another election. But because we don't live in one of those countries, we're just passing a bunch of messaging bills, like in the House and in the Senate. None of them are intended to pass. They're just like statements of ideals and purpose. So that's what HR 109 is. It's staking out the most ambitious form of sort of climate action that we could imagine. And where it sort of lives now is in a few places. One is in the sort of 2020 candidate climate plans. This is Sunrise Movement's scoring card of the various plans. They only have Biden, Warren, and Sanders here. They're the only ones with comprehensive climate plans. Just to give you a sense of kind of how they're thinking about it. Another place that it lives is in the sort of first set of bills that have come out of the House since HR 109 was released. So there's one around public housing that we worked on, which I'll talk about in just a second, and a few others that are in the works. But for us in the center, we sort of imagined ourselves slotting into all of this work in a few ways. So one was to literally begin to draft legislation for members of Congress. So for the public housing bill I'll talk about here in just a second, Bernie's very fond of like going on TV and when he gets asked about a bill, saying like, I wrote the damn bill. But we actually wrote that one for him. We also produced a bunch of supporting research for him and for other people around it. So that was one way. A second was, I think, to treat the Green New Deal as a sort of organizing concept within the design and planning professions as a way for us to think about it as a vehicle for realizing all of the most ambitious ideas that we've been developing for the last 20, 30, 40 years in architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. There's work to be done, innovation to be done, but actually there are a lot of good ideas that just need to be brought to scale and resourced. And the third was within our own university. This is Daniel Donna Cohen and I. To treat all the work we're doing, whether it's programming, coursework, research, as a structure test on our university. So Penn, if you don't know, doesn't have great or really any climate politics. It actually just announced a couple days ago it is no longer investing in tar sands. That's like the most ambitious thing it's done on climate. And so we're treating all of these events as structure tests to see what we can get away with. This event was not, so this is a picture taken from an event called Designing a Green New Deal that we held in September last year. That's Kate Orff on stage alongside Stephanie Kelton, who's the former chief economist for the US Senate's Budget Committee, next to Varshini Prakash, she's the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, next to Peggy Deemer, who was here not that long ago and is like one of my heroes, Kate Aronoff, who's a writer at the New Republic, and then it's me, and then Daniel is next to me. And this is a room full of like 1,400 people who spent 10 hours with us that day going through panels like this, along with Naomi Klein and Jane McAlevey and others, to sort of think about what the details of a Green New Deal ought to be or what they could be. But we've treated all of these as like structure tests at Penn to see what we can actually get away with. The university was not psyched about this event until they walked in on the day of, and it was packed fuller than our former professor, Joe Biden, could fill it, who used to be on our faculty. And then, so thinking about the ways in which the climate legislation has been put together, here we're looking at a package of sort of policy reports developed with Data for Progress around the bill, I think it's HR 3585 that AOC and Sanders introduced in the fall, sort of putting public housing first in line to be decarbonized as a part of a Green New Deal's rollout. Anybody who wants to, you can go read through all of this stuff if you want. There's a bunch of wonky reports we produced to help make the case for why it's important to start there, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. These are all the various authors. For those of you who have ever thought about graduate school, there's a couple of my students, Katie Lampel and Zan Lillahai there. One of the things you can do if you come over to Philly with us is work on some of these things if you want to. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but this is we also, in addition to putting out this report, assembled what I thought would be like a redundant resource, which is just every unit of public housing in the country, along with a few other variables behind it. But it turns out actually that like there is no unified data set for all public housing in the US. This is the first one. And a lot of it we had to request with the help of staff in the House because it's data that is theoretically publicly available, but has to be requested in a very specific way from a very specific person at a very specific time, and that you only get a short window to actually download and use. And so we had to work with Hill staff who've been around for like 20 years to figure out how to actually assemble this data set. And just to give you a sense again, because we're in Nebraska where some of these units are, some of them you probably know, some of them you don't. There's actually a ton of rural public housing. And one of the things we were asked to do after this bill was released was to go down and brief members and their staff on the contents of it. And actually the most excited members of Congress about this bill were members from very conservative districts where there's a lot of public housing, it's almost exclusively occupied by vets, and that is in just horrible, horrendous states of repair. If you were to walk into them, the ceiling is likely going to fall onto your head. And that's happened to a few residents in the last few months. And it's inspired in part, Daniel, if you ever decide to invite a sociologist to do one of these lectures, Daniel, I'm sure, would gladly come. He would read you his love letter to Red Vienna, which is why this picture is here. He makes me put it in all my presentations. I'm not going to talk a ton about it, except to say he draws on that example a lot, in part because the social housing of Vienna is probably one of the world's best models for how social housing can work and be built. It put hundreds, if not thousands, of very well-skilled building and trades craftspeople to work building these beautiful bits of public housing that have now become one of the sort of central sort of housing units for the influx of immigrants coming to Australia from all over the world, particularly from the Middle East. This is a very blurry picture of me talking about transportation because this is kind of where we're headed next. We're working with 3 or 4 members of Congress on putting together a package of bills that will become the Green New Deal for transportation. We can talk about that if you want in the Q&A. I'm not going to talk a ton about this event because I just sort of queued it up for you, but this is just giving you, again, another picture of it because we have lots of pictures. This is Liz Fiedler at the podium. She's my state rep for South Philly, next to Karine Talo, who runs We Act, one of the oldest environmental justice organizations in the country, next to David Roberts, who writes about energy and the environment for Vox, next to Brianna Gunn-Wright, who is really the sort of policy lead on the Green New Deal for AOC, next to Leah Stokes, who those of you who follow like climate and energy Twitter, she's like the climate energy person on there, and a couple of our faculty, Allison Lassiter and Ellen Nices. And this just to give you a sense, this is people milling around before the start of the event in the morning. So there's actually Naomi Klein just like hanging out in the front row with us all day. I don't know who she's sitting next to, but there's my dean in the front on his iPad, which is what he always does. And this is Varshini from the event. Doing something I didn't think was possible, which is at the end of a day getting a room full of like 1,400 people, including a bunch of stuffy and skeptical designers to sing. So this is her leading them in song as a part of her panel presentation. I mentioned Jim Goodman at the beginning as the farming guy that we work with a lot. This is Jim. He's less excited about it, as you can tell. And then I'm going to close just by giving you a quick look at some ways we've been playing around with this in a studio that I run through the center at Penn. It's an interdisciplinary design studio of city planners and landscape architects focused on the Green New Deal. And we asked them really to answer sort of 2 questions in this studio. One is, what are the places in the country that you have to get right from a sort of carbon jobs justice perspective to actually achieve the goals of a Green New Deal? So what are the places that cannot be left behind if we're serious about those goals? And then 2, what are the places that we think are actually ready to be peeled away into a coalition supporting the Green New Deal if its material benefits are made evident right up front, very clearly to them through the first wave of investment? And the places they selected, I think, quite smartly, we didn't pick them. They had to sort of make an argument for why they were going to work here, were sort of generally these 3, the Midwest, Appalachia, and the Mississippi Delta. And we can talk more about why if you want in the Q&A. But the other thing we asked them to do, because this was kind of an experimental studio, was not to produce things for a final review the way you would typically do. We asked them to prepare an exhibition, and we invited members of Congress and their staff, and a few of them came. We invited think tank sort of experts, so people with a lot of technical expertise in the various bits of the Green New Deal, and they came. We invited a bunch of indigenous and people of color organizational leaders to come, and they advised the studio and were there for the final review, or the final exhibition. And instead of standing at boards and sort of having everyone point at each other or just to themselves the whole time, we had our students give a curatorial talk of their work and then sit on panels with me and sort of have a discussion about the work and what it means and what they got out of a semester of this kind of experimental format. And we also didn't really constrain them with a certain set of drawings. So they produced all kinds of interesting things. This is a set of comics that one of our students produced in the Midwest, sort of showing pre and post rollout of the Green New Deal, what life was like in a few different communities there for a few different people. That's the pre, this is the post, this is them going to work sort of decarbonizing Chicago and parts of Iowa and parts of Minnesota. In the Delta, we asked them to go look at something called the Delta Regional Authority, which is a sort of a more contemporary version of the TVA. It's the vehicle through which federal funding for infrastructure gets sort of funneled. And this is them just sort of mapping the different ways in which it's been used to build a whole lot of infrastructure in the lower Mississippi Delta. The same was true for Appalachia. And they also produced a bunch of conventional drawings, which I won't spend a ton of time on. This is looking at land reclamation strategies in Appalachia. For folks who've paid much attention to the sort of energy industry, you know that most of the sort of clean energy jobs, so going to work, giving up your job to build pipelines, to go build solar panels, is never going to happen because those jobs don't pay anything and they don't come with union protections that building pipelines does. But land reclamation is actually the most popular job amongst most fossil fuel industry union laborers because it is a union job. It pays really well and it has lots of protection and doesn't require them to be in a very noxious manufacturing plant for most of their lives, which most solar panel plants are. Then we had them produce a bunch of other sort of things that you might expect to help communicate again, like what some of these different strategies would be. So you're looking here at, you can see a little logo right there with a kind of stack or a tower along with some windmills or turbines. This is looking at something called pumped hydro storage. So this is the use of dams and mines in Appalachia to store power. So one of the reasons you have to do this, it's the lowest tech battery option that we have. So when it's a sunny day and it's really windy and you're generating more power than you can use, a pumped hydro storage battery gives you the ability to pump water with that excess energy uphill to one of these mines. And then at night when there's no sun or the wind isn't blowing, it gets released and powers turbines on its release that fills in that gap in the energy system. You obviously still need other sources of energy to do all of this, but it's one way of thinking about a very low-tech battery that also allows you to think about land reclamation and jobs at the same time. This is them looking at a CLT sort of forest ecosystem for building public housing. They're also making weird objects, so this is a hunting license. And then looking at sort of transects about the different ways in which some of these strategies could be deployed across a larger landscape. And then sort of lastly, we asked them to think about making propaganda. This is part of what the New Deal did quite well, is to think about art's sort of role in communicating and making sense of all the different ways in which the New Deal was transforming people's lives. So what would a Green New Deal's federal arts program look like? This is the Deltas group thinking about that. This is the Midwest, or excuse me, the Appalachia group thinking about that. And this is the Midwest or the Delta thinking about that. These are very weird posters. One of my students was like really into Burning Man, so they made Drowning Man in the Mississippi Delta, where you would just, I guess, go get really high and like play with wooden structures in a river. A big part of their proposal was a set of farming and ecological strategies to clean up the Mississippi and to make a sort of cruise line that would go up and down it. And then, I promise I'm almost done. This is the most boomer thing about me, if I can figure out how to make this work. Yeah, here we go. I just figured out how to record my screen on my laptop like a few weeks ago. So you're looking here at a project we've developed in the center for the last couple of years called an Atlas for the Green New Deal. This is 100 some odd maps of the various sort of spatial ramifications, impacts of climate change on the conterminous US. So we're looking right here, this is a map of the various large landscape conservation efforts underway. There's a ton of these in here, which I'll just flip through. This is a really quick baseline land use map. There's 10,000 or so words of expository text. If you really want to read it, you can. It's up there on the site. Looking at how these things are broken down. Oh, there we go. It also has these like cute little videos. So we're looking at the ecological footprint of the average the median American, how much land each one of us sort of uses for all the various things we consume and do in our everyday lives. About 21.2 acres. The global average, right, is about a third of that. And doing some really basic things like just taking inventory of what's there in terms of like the land and the other resources that are available to us, looking at sort of watersheds and the health and sort of water supply and other factors there, looking at soil, looking at the sort of crops that are there and thinking through what a Green New Deal for agriculture might mean if we were to think about changing this crop mix Same is true for meat, thinking again about like where these things are actually situated. One of the things that Jane Flagle, who I mentioned earlier in talking about trees, I think is quite smart about, is thinking through the political strategy for the rollout of a Green New Deal, requiring us to essentially buy off the things that we don't necessarily want people to do. So if one of those things is sort of extracting fossil fuels or just raising as many cows as they raise, then like how do we actually think about transferring money, material benefits to people in ways that make up for whatever loss they're going to incur when those behaviors change or when those industries change. So you're looking at protected lands, and this is looking at the energy mix, again, just getting a sense of where there's potential for building out a huge clean energy grid. Nebraska, you're like basically covered. You're gonna be fine, all the wind you could ever want. I figured that out today walking around. Solar potential, I think this map is interesting and misleading, right? Because actually, like, does anybody know the world's leading deployer of solar technology? Who has the most panels per capita? I see a head shaking yes. Yeah, it's Germany, which no sun there. It's so dark and cold. And part of the reason is because they've just built, they have a true industrial policy that's made it impossible from a sort of economic perspective for residents to not put solar panels on their roof and not to build giant solar arrays in places where they don't have a lot of development. The financial side of it just would never make sense not to do it. And then trying to, again, just to think creatively about ways we could get people to make sense of what's going to happen where they live if we find ourselves pushing past that 1.5 degree scenario that I showed at the beginning. So this is Chicago, already the highest heat mortality death rate city in the country. So more people die from heat there than any other per capita. And by the end of the century, without abatement, it'll have the same temperature profile as Dallas, Texas. I went to school in Austin. It's hot as hell. I can't even imagine like being in Chicago with that temperature. And then we've been using the work of someone named Matthew Hauer, a geographer at the University of Georgia, who's the first person in the country to begin counting the number of houses that will be underwater under the most sort of conservative sea level rise scenarios and building demographic projection models about where they'll go based on all kinds of things. So those are the out migration. These are the in migration where people are expected to go. Some of them you can see are still in coastal communities. Part of that is because we leave all of these choices up to the market, not up to government to sort of organize or direct. And then adding on to that, this sort of addition of 100 million people by 2060 and what it would mean from an urbanism perspective to actually have to build enough to accommodate them. So you're looking at scenarios there at the top of about 13 New Yorks, the equivalent of that at that density, about 34 Chicagos, and about 63 Phoenixes. And all of that's being layered on, again, with this increase in temperature by the end of the century. And I won't go into like a ton of detail on this, but all of the information is there if you want to pore through the atlas, looking at total economic effects. The one that's more interesting, I think, from that bundle of information is coming from ag. So because of changes in heat and precipitation and all kinds of other factors, there are huge swaths of the country where agriculture is no longer going to be viable, where culturally and economically everything is organized entirely around agriculture. I grew up in a community like that in Arkansas. I don't know Lincoln particularly well, but looking at it on that map, it seems also like that's probably true for parts of at least the surrounding region. And if we know from the history of what happened to the Rust Belt post-industrialization, about what happens when we don't anticipate what to do with communities that are hollowed out by huge economic restructuring, and we don't think about what to do in all the places where they're moving, like North Dakota as part of the shale gas boom and all the problems that the sort of rapid urbanization of that part of the country have created, that we're in serious trouble. And so I guess I will I'm not going to go into this map again. This is one that my boss, Richard Weller, loves because he just loves the term big ideas, so that's why it says history of big ideas. But these are some of the things we've talked about from the New Deal and onward, already expressed and built out across the landscape of the US. Just as a way, I think, of, again, reinforcing this argument that the sort of condition of government we find ourselves with today as a sort of small, feeble, inept, sort of impossible to operate apparatus is that way by design. We've designed it to be inoperable. And that there have been moments in American history where that has not been true, and that part of what a Green New Deal will demand is that we find ways to make it true again. So with that, I want to thank you for inviting me and for sticking around for the talk. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions, if anybody would like to ask Billy a question. You want to start? Okay, Yusha.
Hi, I just want to ask something. So this is all sound very exciting. So I want to ask, and thank you so much for this wonderful and inspiring talk. So I just want to maybe get started by asking. So all of this sounds very exciting. If any of our students wants to get involved in all of this, like what are the some of the skill sets or things that they should consider pursuing even during their years in the college, and how do you what are the channels that they might get involved in and engaged in the process as students, maybe through, I don't know, internships, fellowships? What are the things that they can start to look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'll just sort of put those in two buckets. Like there's stuff to do through your time on campus and stuff to do probably off campus that makes sense. And off campus, I mean, the things that were most transformative as a part of my like political education and my education more broadly, were just finding like organizations and communities that were getting organized around things I cared about and like pouring myself into them. So one of my first jobs, or not jobs, but like one of my first things to do internship-wise as a student, as an undergrad, was to work with Dreamers in Arkansas, so undocumented students. This is happening amongst a bunch of turmoil within the state in which they're going from being charged in-state tuition to international tuition because they don't have social security numbers, and obviously don't have any power because if they were to out themselves as undocumented students, they would be deported immediately. So working with them to sort of figure out like what the levers of power are was hugely formative for me. I don't imagine doing any of the work I've done now without beginning there. Although I say that, I mean, I grew up in public housing and grew up in a family that like lost everything in the recession, so that also was like a huge piece of my like of political education. So we can talk about that stuff if we want to, but on campus, like, look, I don't know enough about the curriculum to know like what there's space for, but I was lucky in a 5-year BLA program to have tons of electives. I took them all over the place in political science and environmental science, in history and in like social theory and thought and sociology, all of which served, I mean, my landscape architecture degree served me really, really well, but so did those other classes outside of it. And I gave the firm life a shot, and it's not for everyone. And I think like if it's not for you, it's okay. Like that was a huge important thing for me to realize that like never going to make sense for me to be in a typical A&E firm. I was like losing my mind there. But finding other places where you can work on the sort of subjects you want. So for me, that began by working on the 2008 Obama campaign. I was in Iowa actually for that campaign. And then eventually getting asked, I think in large part because of that, to go to work for them in DC, which isn't a thing that most landscape architects get asked to do, but it's also because my education and my experience and all those other things were not typical of landscape architects. And especially at a place like Penn where like everyone I'm surrounded by on the faculty and student body, they're like, I don't know, like 8th generation college graduate, half their parents were professors, they all went to like elite charter schools and elite like liberal arts colleges for undergrad. Like I didn't get to do any of that. Like none of those things are true for me. So I had a different class background than a lot of them, and that I think shaped up how I thought about and sort of created some opportunities for myself to do this kind of work. One of the things I'm really dedicated to both there and in general across the profession is trying to help other people find those on-ramps into places that I think are not like held up as like desirable for landscape architects coming out of school. Like all of our students want to go to field ops and like, I don't know, like Sasaki and WXY and wherever, which are great, amazing firms they should aspire to go to. But if they want to do other things, they should be okay. They should not be made to feel bad about doing that. Yeah. Back there.
So just thinking about your Washington, D.C. background, I was wondering what your thoughts and feelings are about the Trump administration's executive order about the neoclassicism in federal architecture.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a very long modern history of fascists really loving classical architecture. I don't think it's a huge surprise that's what he wants, the executive government or the federal government to do. I mean, I'm not surprised. I wish that like the design community was as outraged about this as they were about, building detention centers and building border walls and putting children into them and separating them from their families. And I'm glad this is like getting mainstream architects like really mad. Like those things, the cage part, like they're not so mad about, but like columns, they're really pissed about. But yeah, look, like it's an executive order. It's whether or not he actually signs it. I don't know if he has yet. I think it's just been floated as draft language. But it's the thing we'll undo like the minute he's thrown out of office. Again, like it's not a big surprise. If you look back to like all of our former right-wing regimes across the world, all of the fascists have loved classical architecture, neoclassical architecture. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that this is coming up again.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure if you guys have questions, you're welcome to ask them to Billy. Thank you for your lecture, and have a wonderful weekend.